Wonderful 11th graders. Let's get going. Today's topic is going to be C2 communities and ecosystems. Essential idea for this lesson is we're focusing on changes in the community structure and how they are affected by different organisms. So before we get going into this, I want you to kind of think back to your carbon cycle diagram you made and think about other nutrients now besides carbon, maybe like phosphorus, nitrogen, calcium. So the questions are, where are nutrients stored in a biome? And which biomes do you think have more nutrients and which have less? So you guys did some presentations on biomes earlier in this unit, and you probably can guess which ones have more nutrients than others. Yes, they are all successful in their own ways, but what species can live there depends on how much nutrients are there. So we're going to look into today that focus on nutrients and how they can impact what organisms or how much biomass can be in that ecosystem. So just to kind of think about stored, though, this word, remember it's a word like sink is where large amounts of nutrients are stored. So a lot of times it's soil, leaf litter on the ground, and as well as the living organisms that are there. Atmospheres, the ocean was a storage, right? So we're going to look at that more today. Okay, here we go. All right, so our first understanding is at the top here. So a food web shows all the possible food chains in a community. So we went over this in our last lecture, but just remember that the key thing here is that multiple organisms can be at different levels in a food chain. They are not always within one situation. Like here, these primary consumers can sometimes be secondary consumers or tertiary consumers. Sometimes even producers can be a primary consumer. They might eat other organisms, but they also have photosynthetic abilities. So they can be a producer and a primary consumer. We, for example, could be primary consumers or we could be secondary consumers. So just remember that, and it's down here, we can fulfill different levels of a food web. And that there's always going to be in a food web more producers, more than just one. It's showing multiple food chains connected. So this is going back with what I had just said, that not all organisms only are classified at one trophic level. So let me give you some examples here, besides the ones I gave you. How about fungus? So down here, many fungi are classified as detrivores or sapiotrophs, which means they would feed on dead things, right? But yet they sometimes feed on living things. Like this is someone's foot, so this is athlete's foot. So this fungus is feeding on this living organism. So they are technically not just fulfilling the decomposer part of the food web, but they are actually at a secondary consumer level. This is an example of one of the photosynthetic organisms that eats things as well. Euglena is an example of that. Here's a picture of it. And it ingests things through phagocytosis, but it also can do photosynthesis. So it fills two different trophic levels in a food web. So in summary, organisms exist within food webs. Food webs consist of many interlinked food chains. Therefore, organisms exist in multiple food chains, often at different trophic levels. When you are stating an organism's trophic level in a test, it needs to be done relative to the food chain that they are giving you as an example. So they won't just make you have to guess. They'll give you more of a description of what's occurring there. All right, one of the skills you have to know how to do is to make the Gursha Mul diagrams. These were first developed in 1976. And what they do is they show you the difference in nutrient flow and storage between different ecosystems. Now, you are going to have to be able to analyze these, sometimes maybe construct one based off the information they give you in a description. So they're always set up the same. So this is the basic beginning of a diagram, of a Gursha Mul diagram. So there's always the biomass circle, the litter circle, and the soil circle. These are the sinks. These are where the nutrients are stored. The arrows are showing, these blue arrows are showing the general movement of how nutrients get from soil to biomass as plant uptake. From biomass to litter, it's littering, so the leaves falling off the trees and laying on the ground. And then litter passes nutrients to soil through decomposition of those leaves as they turn back into soil. Please don't get the word litter confused with trash on the ground. It's talking about leaf litter from trees. The way that these different sinks can change is through rainfall, can change the amount of leaf litter because it can help with decomposition, and then also surface runoff. For when there's lots of rain or flooding or mudslides, can change the amount of litter. So the green is input and the red is output. And then with soil, weathering of parent rock, so through rainfall or different erosion, wind, sun, snow, those things can weather the rocks or the soil, and that can lead to leaching, which would take nutrients out of that soil. Okay? So that's what this slide is showing you there. So we'll keep going. So this is showing you the flows between the sinks. So just to be more clear about what littering is, it gives you a description here, and same with decomposition. So when you analyze a particular ecosystem, the diameter of the sink, so this circle here, the diameter of the sink is proportional to the mass of nutrients stored in each sink. So these circles will change sizes. So you'll see maybe one circle being larger and the other circles being smaller, and that lets you know where the majority of the storage of nutrients is. The thickness of the arrows will change as well. These ones are all the same in this picture, but I'll show you some examples that don't. The thickness tells you where the majority of the movement of nutrients is happening in that ecosystem. It's not always a perfect balance. So here are some comparisons of each of these different biomes here. So a taiga biome, or a temperate forest, you could probably take a look at it and take a guess at which one has the most nutrients. So they're all three different sizes. So what you should have guessed is that the litter is the biggest storage, then it would be biomass, then soil. Notice the thickness of this arrow here. Most of the nutrients are moving from biomass to leaf litter through decomposition. Now, the way what affects the transfer of these nutrients the most in this main triangle here between biomass, litter, and soil is the temperature and amount of rainfall or precipitation in these areas. So in a taiga, it's usually very cold. When the temperatures are cold, that doesn't allow for a lot of decomposition. So it's not going to allow for this movement of nutrients to get to the soil. If it's not getting to the soil, then it's not going to be taken up by the plants. So the majority is from whatever plants are still successful, and it's sitting as leaf litter in that environment. In the desert environment, you're going to see that the majority is in the soil and for the storage, and that the movement is mainly between biomass and leaf litter. The reason for the lack of transfer of nutrients in a desert is because it's very dry. So there's a lack of rainfall and it's very hot. So though it does have hot temperatures, which would help with decomposition, you would think, it's so dry, there's no moisture to help break down those leaves and that dead material. It just crumbles in a way. Here's a tropical rainforest, which usually has the perfect amount of rain and warm conditions that really lets decomposition thrive. Notice that biomass is the highest, so living organisms have most of the nutrients, and then the transfers are huge. There's a lot of movements of nutrients in this ecosystem because of the wet and warm conditions. Notice also going into with the soil, because remember, or with litter, rainfall could really increase this, and then this would be surface runoff here. So there's not a lot of surface runoff. So that means that water is staying within that ground and it's decomposing those nutrients and it's turning into soil. And within the soil, remember these two arrows here are weathering because there's lots of rain, it's weathering the soil. And then this would be leaching. So there are sometimes a lot of leaching of nutrients from the soil because there's so much rain, it moves them to other parts or into rivers or waterfalls nearby. Okay, so this is going over gross production versus net production, and we talked about this in the last lecture. So what you're seeing here is, or let's remember that energy is not entirely lost in a food web or in a food chain. Organisms do trap some of that energy and it forms biomass. So in this snail here, even though it ingested a bunch of food, it assimilated it, it produced ATP, and then it's storing it as biomass. But it is losing some of that energy through respiration to make its ATP, and also through its own feces or decomposition, and also just heat, right? So, but some of it will stay as biomass. So the two words you need to know is gross production. This is how much energy was trapped in the organic material produced by plants in the ecosystem. So this was the original how much energy was there that went in at first to this snail. And then the net production is what we usually ask. So you might be asked to tell them what the net production is. So you would take the gross production and you would subtract it by however much energy was lost through respiration of that organism. And then whatever is left would be what the number you would get is the NP, or net production. And that would be the amount of biomass that is available for the next trophic level. So looking here, here's the equation, NP equals GP minus R. So just the point of this is I want you to be able to understand what's actually moving here within the movement of what are they talking about with net production and gross production. We're focusing on organic matter or nutrients, okay? So organic matter could be, and they're all down here, starch, stored energy, proteins, and structural molecules. A lot of storage energy and nutrients are used by each individual, and those will become their biomass, which is the total dry mass of an organic matter in an organism's ecosystem. So this equation is trying to figure out how much energy was able to be converted into biomass, subtracting the idea of respiration and how much respiration occurred. A more efficient organism for respiration will end up with more biomass. Okay, so one thing that you need to understand is the idea of conversion ratios in sustainable food production practices. So when you're a farmer or someone in agriculture, you're trying to make money, right? So you're trying to make an efficient process that's not going to cost you a lot of money, but you're going to get the most output, the most product that you want. So what they look at is a food conversion ratio, or an FCR. So this measures an animal's efficiency in converting feed mass into the desired output. So for a cow, a dairy cow, your output that you want is milk. If you're looking for meat, it might be a beef cattle. So you're going to weigh how much that cow weighs so that you know how much meat production you're going to get. Or a pig. Often pigs are used for meat production. So how much does that pig weigh? So the way you find the FCR is the mass of the food eaten by that animal divided by their increase in the desired output. So how much milk did they produce? How much do they weigh now that you've been feeding them? Okay, so and that's going to over a specific period of time. So usually if you look at these, the FCR for beef cattle is 5 to 20, pigs are 3 to 3.2, and so forth. The lower the FCR, though, the more efficient the method of food production was. So that farmer's goal is to have a lower FCR. The question, though, is so a good low FCR is going to be obtained by minimizing the loss of energy by respiration of an animal. So that means restricting animal movement, slaughtering the animals at younger ages, optimizing feed. So like the type of feed you use is more efficient in digesting. It may not be what they need exactly, but it'll be still calories for them. And like for example with cattle, feeding them corn, where normally cattle wouldn't eat corn, they would eat grass. So it's more efficient though in digestion to feed them corn, and they get a bigger mass out of the cow. So the questions here in red is, how ethical are the practices that lead to a low FCR? And what is more important, efficient food production or the ethical treatment of animals? This could be something you could think about with a TOK for subject-specific TOK. So comparison of pyramids of energy for different ecosystems. We did this in the last lecture, so just as a reminder, When you're looking at a pyramid for energy, the larger base is going to be producers, right? And then you have the primary consumers, secondary consumers, tertiary consumers. It always needs to be labeled this way. It should not be a triangle. It should be stepped. And remember that it's always in kilojoules for energy. So units of energy per unit area of land over how much, per unit time. So kilojoules per meter squared per year. Remember that only 10% moves on because 90% of the energy is usually lost because of things not ingested, not digested, it's been excreted or lost from heat. Also remember there's two other types of pyramids, the biomass pyramid, which is based on the weight or biomass of organisms in that area, versus this would be a numbers pyramid. So this represents, for example, how many organisms are present in that ecosystem. So this is one tree, that's why it's so small, and these different species are being supported by that one tree. So usually when we look at pyramids of energy, you are going to be looking at something more like this, and you should be seeing a 10% difference in each, or 90% loss in each step. Okay, so reasons for high net productivity of an ecosystem. If there's a high base, a high amount of producers, you're going to have a more potential for more trophic levels in an ecosystem. So if there's more producers, this means more energy is available to the ecosystem. So the higher so that's higher primary productivity is one thing, but then also the efficiency of energy transferred. Certain species, like we talked about in last lecture, are more efficient with their metabolic ways. So like we use a lot of energy because we're always trying to maintain a constant temperature, where some ectotherm type animals, they can just go sit in the sun or sit in the shade, and that controls their temperatures. And that's actually more efficient with digestion. So depending on what species that those producers are supporting, if they are more efficient in energy transfer, there's more potential for more trophic levels. But usually it doesn't make it past 5 trophic levels because energy eventually runs out. Okay, so looking at biomes. So the type of stable ecosystems that will emerge in an area is usually predictable based on a climate. So remember that a biome is a geographical area that has a particular climate and sustains a specific community of plants and animals. So the biosphere definition is anywhere on Earth where living things are. So we would consider the surface of Earth usually the biosphere. These are the terms that we usually use to discuss a biome. So the main factors are always temperature and rainfall that separates a biome from another biome. These two things are controlled by the location's latitude and longitude, its elevation, and its proximity to water or the sea. Temperature is influential because it affects the rate of metabolism that can occur for organisms in that area. In the same way that fresh water availability also is critical to growth of organisms and nutrition of organisms in that area. And rainfall and warmer temperatures are more common near the equator and less common at the poles. This graph here is going to help you analyze, it's called a climatograph, and it's a diagram which shows the relative combination of temperature and precipitation in an area. So you can see here on the bottom, it's showing you temperature. Here is 0, and it's increasing to 30. This is going into the negative cold temperatures. And this is showing you how much annual rainfall it's getting in centimeters. So you can see the tropical rainforest is high in rainfall and also high in temperatures, where a tundra is going to be negative in temperatures and also very low in rainfall. Showing primary succession. So this is a skill you'll have to do looking at different graphs and growth of different species. But first, let's get into what primary succession is. So primary succession is a part of the term ecological succession. Ecological succession is the predictable and orderly changes in composition of an ecosystem over time. So there's always first a primary succession. Primary succession is the emergence of an entirely new ecosystem, such as a volcanic island. Usually what we think of is like a new ground that has been covered by lava and it's hardened over time. There's no growth. So this picture here is a new volcanic island forms in Tonga. So that would be primary succession. Or when a glacier retreats for the first time and the ice melts away, when I say retreat, it's melting away, that land has not seen growth ever potentially, and that would be considered primary succession. It's its first emergence of a new ecosystem. Secondary succession is the replacement of an ecosystem by following some environmental change. Maybe it's a forest fire, maybe it's land that was farmed, and so all those trees were cut down and now it's growing back. Maybe humans built a community or some buildings and those buildings have been abandoned and now the ecosystem's taking back that area. So this picture is showing you a woodland growing back after a grassland that had been cleared. You just have to be patient, and you'll notice this is representing time. So over 300 years, you start to see what species start to arrive. And notice they're always smaller at first, and then they become much larger species because the ecosystem now has the nutrients to sustain larger species or larger plant life. This is showing another image of it. So you can see a cleared land here. This would be maybe lava or a dried lava or an area where a retreated glacier has occurred. And so you're seeing eventually there's just like moss and lichen. And then once those lichen and moss kind of die and decompose over time, they start to add nutrients to that soil. And then that more nutritious soil can grow different types of plants. And when those plants die, it adds nutrients to the soil. Though those plants are still growing, but some of them die, right, eventually. And that changes the soil chemistry, which then allows for larger plants to be sustainable there, and so forth. It's like a chain reaction. This would be secondary succession, so you're seeing maybe this land was farmed or changed from a forest fire, and there's regrowth over time in the same way that the primary succession occurred. Except it doesn't have to work as hard because a lot of that soil layer is already there from the first succession. So this is showing you the primary succession is the emergence of a new community from a new ecosystem. So this is me showing you more specifically what's occurring over time. Gross production will increase. So first there's those colonizers or the lichens on the rock surface. Soil will then build up following death of smaller lichens. So the soil becomes more nutritious and built up. Larger plants can then take root. So soil will deepen. And then productivity plateaus as soil's carrying capacity is reached. So once the soil's carrying capacity is reached, that means the amount of nutrients there are able to sustain these larger trees. Species diversity also increases, so which types of plants you're seeing over time. So more soil allows for burrowers and worms and detrivores. More plants take root and provide new niches. And then more death will lead to more soil and nutrient recycling. During succession, living organisms are going to change the abiotic environment. So those non-living things, those nutrient levels. So living organisms help add to the soil. So soil produced by detrivores. So remember, decomposers are what's producing that healthy, nutritious soil. So produced by detrivores like worms following death of other plants and animals. Detrivores and bacteria fix the nitrogen in the soil, like the inorganic form, and change it into a form that can be used by plants. Decay accumulates minerals that are going to really help the roots of plants grow. And then aerated by burrowing animals in the soil for more respiration and drainage. So that allows water to really work through that soil. So this is how living organisms can help within the soil succession occur. Plants' roots also help. They bind to that soil and they prevent erosion. They support large plants and they uptake, filter, and recycle massive amounts of water, preventing flood and drought in those areas. Microclimates are also something that can occur, they're not as large of a biome, for example, but they can sometimes occur in little areas like, for example, on the forest floor. It's kind of its own unique microclimate. These are small niches of differing temperatures, light levels, and humidity, and these niches provide opportunities for more species, in turn affecting the abiotic environment. So microclimates built in within larger ecosystem climates really can benefit and change different areas within a biome. So here's looking at the data finally. And so you can see now, after understanding all that background, you can see the x-axis is in years, and the y-axis is showing you individuals, so species per hectare. A hectare is larger than an acre. And you can see here's the key for what species are represented by the bars. And it's focusing on this image here. This is in Alaska, and it's after a glacier is retreating. So it's talking about the lower bay, the middle bay, and the upper bay. So this would be the upper bay, the middle bay, and the lower bay. And these are species of trees around the edges. And what they noticed is as the glacier retreated and the water was starting to form, the species that are in the upper bay, which is still closer to the ice region, you can see it started off with more of the cottonwood trees and a little bit more of this spruce tree, and then also the adler. But over time, the cottonwood tree wasn't successful anymore there, but it probably gave way to the adler tree having more success. Where here in the lower bay, you can see it started with spruce trees mostly, but over time, the adler tree dies off here, but you can still see there's way more spruce. Well, there's still a presence of spruce trees, but there's a lot of the hemlock tree by the end, and that seems to be more of the dominant species. But you can see how they've changed. The amount of each of these species per hectare have changed over time. So that's showing you the succession of the species as this glacier, which is finally having growth because the ice has melted for the first time. So it's showing you primary succession. This graph is showing you after the Mount St. Helens volcano exploded in Washington State in the United States. This was the loss of species because this is in 1980 when it exploded, but you can see over time, this is its new succession of species. We would consider this still primary succession because when volcanoes explode, the lava basically creates a new land of soil, a new huge thick layer of soil that's never had growth before. So it's considered primary succession. It's not like a forest fire because forest fires usually leave some of the remains behind. So here's an example of secondary succession caused by disturbances to an ecosystem. So it walks you through the full steps 1, 2, 3, and 4, all the way to 8. So you can see this was a stable ecosystem, but then a forest fire occurred. It burnt everything to the ground, but slowly smaller shrub-like grass organisms formed, and then larger trees were able to grow, and then even larger ones, and then it was back to a larger sustainable ecosystem. You can see here, this would be an example of secondary succession. So cropland that has been left behind, and you can see in year 1 you have horseweed that starts growing, year 2 white asters, and then broom sage. So you can see how the land has slowly gone through succession over time. Eventually trees will start to grow, but this is just within 3 years. So disturbances can be natural, like a forest fire, or caused by humans, like farming. So you could do for an IA next year an investigation on secondary succession. So you could look at primary ecosystems and how they've started going through secondary succession. Some examples could be any abandoned settlements or communities or farmland. And you could do like quadrants and start counting for species diversity or species richness or evenness. You could look at fields recovering after a fire damage. There could be databases about this information already, or in national parks, or fire breaks in woodlands. And what you could measure is species diversity, stem seedling densities, the biomass in an area, the canopy coverage, so like the light intensity at the surface, depth and volume of leaf litter, and you could test soil nutrient levels changing over time. And that can help you see an area going through succession. So that could be, if you're someone who wants to get outside and do more of an outdoor lab investigation, that's something you can do next year. Okay, and this is our last slide here. So considering one example of how humans interfere with nutrient cycling, we are considered an accelerant or an accelerant for flow of matter in and out of ecosystems because we're often changing things very quickly. So this is just looking at agriculture as an example. So harvesting of crops are going to affect biomass and because we're removing it from an agricultural ecosystem. Water runoff or leaching from agricultural fields results in a buildup of phosphates and nitrates in waterways and leads to eutrophication. Because of the irrigation of crops, a lot of times these nutrients that are in soil run off from the soil and into nearby irrigation channels, which lead to rivers or lakes and can cause eutrophication, which is basically that growth of green algae on the surface, and it blocks out light and things die underneath and it loses oxygen. Also over here, nitrate fertilizers produced from atmospheric nitrogen. So we often add a lot of fertilizers which can affect the natural cycling of the nitrogen nutrient in soil. And then here, phosphates mined and converted to fertilizers. In order to get these fertilizers, we have to mine for them. So phosphates and nitrogen are usually the two main ingredients in fertilizers. And so we have to tear up and mine different lands in order to provide for agriculture. So this is a way that we are interfering with nutrient cycling, and it's a way that we cause secondary succession to occur in ecosystems. Okay, that is finally the last slide. Thank you for listening. Please make sure you put your notes in ManageBack, and I hope you have a great day. Let me know if you have any questions in the chat.